You want both. You can focus on one for sure, but you shouldn't neglect either. Oh, you're still here? Okay, fine, let's talk about it properly in the rest of the video. The debate between whether you should go for extra morale or discipline when playing EU4 is an old one. I'm sure you have all fought wars where the enemy had significantly higher morale or significantly higher discipline than you. In both of these cases, the war probably felt completely unwinnable. Honestly, because in many of those, it probably was. With morale, fighting someone with 7 morale while you run out with 5 is brutal. They start the battle having basically won almost a third of it already. And since morale damage dealt scales with the morale of the troops dealing the damage, they are dealing significantly more of that to you while you deal relatively less back. Being behind in discipline, however, feels even more brutal. If you're at least somewhat on par with morale, your troops will stay in the fight, but they won't stay alive. They'll melt quickly while the enemy takes minimal casualties, and to add insult to injury, since morale damage still scales with casualties received, since you're dying so much in the battle, chances are you're going to lose the battle too, even if you manage to keep your front line and back lines full. Anyway, before I go really into depth with this topic, a like on the video would be appreciated, and a subscription would be amazing if you haven't already. But with that all said and done, let's get back to the question. Morale or discipline? See, usually I find the time we ask this question is when you're sitting around with a morale or discipline advisor, looking at both of them and thinking, which one should I pick? 5 discipline or 10 morale? Sometimes you're thinking between which country to form, or even whether you should save that discipline mission or go ahead and pop the morale ones. This is a question I want to address with this video. See, you're not the only one who has to make this decision. When playing EU4, the AI also needs to evaluate the strength of morale and discipline for the enemy armies, as well as its own armies, so that it can avoid going into battles it has no chance of winning, as well as evaluating when it should probably engage you as there's a reasonable chance of victory. Thankfully, this evaluation code is accessible to us, and while it should not be treated as an answer to the question, it's something cool I wanted to share with you. So, if you go to the drive where you installed Steam as well as EU4, get over to Programs 86, head on over down to Steam, Steam Apps Common, and into EU4 finally, you'll find access to all of the files that Paradox provides us for both modding purposes, as well as, I guess, just seeing where things are. These are the files that I tend to look through when I'm trying to locate modifiers for these videos. But another thing that's cool inside of them is within the common folder, and when we scroll down to the bottom, we're going to locate a file called defines, and this is a defines.lua file which contains, well, a lot of definitions. And in many cases, when mods change things like artillery taking damage from back row, artillery taking morale damage in back row, how much forts cost, basically all the other things under the sun, all of this stuff is stored in a defines file. See, I've opened the defines file with my coding editor of choice, and as we can see, there is an AI unit strength evaluation section. This is how the AI evaluates unit strength. It needs to reduce every single military modifier in the game, including enemy soldier count, into one number. Let's call that number Y, and calculate one for its own army. Let's call it X. And if X is sufficiently larger than Y, well, within some reasonable limit, it'll attempt to engage. So how does the AI evaluate it? For morale and discipline, it's a Taylor series. So if you haven't covered that in school yet, or you dropped math before you had access to it, don't worry, they're not as scary as they look. Otherwise, I encourage you to locate the defines file yourself inside the game code, and honestly have a look around if you haven't before. You can also find some really weird modifiers I personally never assumed you could actually change, unless you've modded EU4 before, in which case you've probably change the defines file, and in that case, I guess so you know where the stuff is. One way of making sure that you keep up on morale is making sure you have high prestige, as that's going to give you some morale, as well as making sure you have a high amount of power projection, as well as army tradition, and all those things can lead up to quite a bit of morale and let you not fall behind. Furthermore, you should also keep in mind that you can go ahead and pop Defender of Faith if your faith has access to it, as well as starting a Golden Age if you really want to squeeze out some extra morale in those do or die situations. As for discipline, it's a bit harder to squeeze it out in an emergency for sure. You tend to still have access to a discipline advisor, which you should be running if you're really far behind in discipline to at least mitigate that gap somewhat, playing countries with discipline in their ideas, as well as religions that have access to discipline as part of their modifiers. In this case, I'm playing as Hindu, but you can also play the Orthodox and even Protestants, although they only have 2.5%, and some other select religions, again, have access to discipline inside of them. Quite a few national ideas also provide you with access to discipline, and a classic version of this is quality for the 5% discipline finisher, then going ahead to grab economic for the policy, and then followed by offensive. Now, when you do activate the policy, the weapon quality standards for 5% discipline, have another 5% discipline inside of your ideas, get 5% discipline from your religion, and run a discipline advisor, you're going to be looking at a pretty respectable 130% discipline, which means that 125% discipline is achievable for most countries. With that said now, let's consider the two possible builds that we can do about this though. The classic MP build of building around discipline, and while they were certainly meta dominant a couple patches ago, with a couple of the reworks, especially towards quantity, and the reworks towards morale, with the access to morale damage received modifiers, and a general buff to morale builds overall, they aren't universally the undisputed best anymore. Discipline is still something that you should not be neglecting. So before we consider a discipline build, let's first consider what are going to be the weaknesses of this discipline build. The big one is when you're coming up against a morale build, you're going to be losing battles. Discipline builds in this fashion work best when you have a large country with a lot of places that you can defend, as well as having a good sized economy to maintain a prolonged conflict yourself. Part of this economy as well includes access to a lot of manpower, so that you also, while taking attrition, can maintain a decent amount of attrition in terms terms of trading with your opponent. So what is the best area that is economically rich, has a lot of money, and has a lot of defensible terrain? Well, the best place for this is actually Persia. If we look at this area within simple terrain, we can see it is covered in incredibly defensible mountains. That is because Persia is not actually a real country, it's just one very big mountain pretending to be a country. This area is just beautiful for defending, and to top it all off, you still have some territories like some grassland and dry lands they can use to squeeze out an economy in the process. Furthermore, with Persia being your main node, you're in the right position to exploit a lot of the Indian trade going into you, even if you don't directly own it. Persia as a trade node itself still has access to silks and other excellent trade goods for you to maintain an economy, which should let you develop your country enough to support the manpower and cash requirements of a discipline-based attrition army. So again, are you going to win battles? No, not at first. Not until the enemy loses hundreds of thousands, if not millions, fighting you in the mountains, taking even more attrition in the process. And when he finally runs out of manpower, well, then you can start to press them. To really top this off, if you're playing a Zoroastrian country, you're going to have access to your own Russia in your own pocket. Namely, that you can access to this monument here, which gives you access to 10 discipline, as well as some even fire damage received modifiers, allowing you to maintain yourself in the battle even longer. So, when you do go ahead and form Persia, make sure you do take the new traditions and ambitions. You have access to 5% discipline to really help your discipline build as mentioned earlier, but to top it off, you also gain access to 15% national manpower, as well as 15% manpower recovery speed, and this dev cost is going to help you dev manpower to stay in the battles longer, and your economy is definitely not going to suffer, with access to 10% goods produced, 10% production efficiency, and even some tax to really help you going. You also get access to another 15 morale of armies, but having this extra 15% morale of armies allows you to not fall too far behind compared to other countries that will be doing a morale build, so it's definitely not something to complain about in the process. Not every country is built to be an incredibly defensible Persia. I won't be discussing any other specific builds, but another area that is wonderful to hold and defend is Austria. In fact, the Tyrol state is basically one beautiful mountainous defensible position that can even pay for itself with the Tyrol gold mine. The Alps overall are a pretty good defensible position, and unlike something like the Spanish Pyrenees, the Alps are actually in an area where you're going to be doing a lot of fighting. This means that Austria, as well as France, Italy, or any other German who takes over Switzerland is able to utilize this land quite effectively. If you seek a defense in depth, however, you want to look north. Germany is very heavily forested, with most of this area being woods and even one province being a forest. I'm not sure why, but I guess it's there, really standing out. Forests may not be as good as mountains or even hills, but they make up for it by making you have a slight advantage every time the enemy are going through your territory, which means that you can force your enemies to really fight for every single province. Now, there are other places for good fighting throughout the world, and every region has local defensible strongholds, of course. But if you're looking for a discipline and more attritional style of warfare, where you don't try to win battles, but you try to win the war, this is the best place to try it. Russia and Zoroastrian monument Persias are also located perfectly to exploit this. But what are the weaknesses of these builds? If your country is small, say you're trying to do this as Switzerland, losing battles is going to lose you the war, full stop. See, when you're small, it's extra critical you win the battles, since 3 or even 2 major defeats can lead to your entire country being overrun. So to be able to pull off this kind of warfare, it is crucial you have both the manpower supplies to maintain these trades, as well as the ability to defend yourself in depth. Let us now compare this to a morale build. Let's assume you're playing a country with at least 15% morale in ideas. France, Castile, Andalusia, Poland, and Swabia. So not exactly the most uncommon tags. You are able to then go ahead and combine that with defensive ideas for 15% morale of armies, after which you can go ahead and grab religious. You can also pick up 10% manpower and true faith and a policy for later. Most importantly, after this, go ahead and take quantity. Quantity is really going to help you, well, actually stay in your fights. Quantity and religious are going to combine to give you field soldiers and soldiers prayer books for 10% morale of armies. This means that you'll be running 15% morale from your ideas as mentioned previously, 15% from defensive, 10% from the policy, and you can combine that with a morale advisor for a further 10% morale of armies. As you can see here, I've neglected to increase the prestige, power protection, or army tradition, but despite that, with our base morale of 3, we're still looking at 4.5 morale. This is going to represent a 1.5 morale swing past Miltech 4 and a 2 morale swing past Miltech 15. This swing gets even bigger when you get much later in the game, such as by Miltech 26, but let's be honest, most campaigns are over at that point, and you're going to have quite a bit more manpower from both the religious ideas, manpower and true faith, as well as just general manpower from quantity and the force center from quantity as well. As opposed to the previous build, there's nothing too specific here in terms of playstyle. You want to walk in and win battles. You will suffer casualties, but as long as you don't run out of manpower and you keep winning battles, you should be fine. And the plan is to make the enemy run out of country before you run out of men. If you want to try this for yourself, I'm actually going to suggest you do this as France. See, France has access to the same 15% morale of armies, but they are topping this up with 20% manpower from their country, as well as 5% discipline inside their ideas. Now, of course, Poland has this as well, but France also makes up for this with a truly incredibly powerful mission tree and an excellent position to dominate Europe. See, Persia over there may be great at hiding in the Afghan mountains, but you don't need to hide in your natural habitat. But what are the weaknesses of this kind of morale build? Well, as mentioned before, it's your inability to actually deal damage. Most of your kills are going to be coming from running down the enemy and getting stack wipes. But if someone is able to make you run out of manpower before you fully occupy them, or in the worst possible scenario, actually start to win battles against you, you're going to be having a really hard time. You want to keep your wars as short as possible and aim to be decisive in them. But with that all said and done, it's conclusion time. Honestly, there are great potentials with both morale and discipline builds, and I encourage you to try them for yourself. However, the answer from the start remains, you want both. Having low morale, even with insane discipline, will make it really hard for you to actually stay in the battles long enough to deal your casualties. And having no discipline with high morale means the troops will just sit there in the battle, being all high-spirited and noble as they get slaughtered by the enemy. However, does conclude the video. I hope you learned something new, but that is all I have time for today. Goodbye.